He arrived with nothing that resembled destiny. No fortune, no title, no guarantee that his name would ever matter. In the late 18th century, when America itself was still unfinished and unstable, a young German immigrant stepped onto unfamiliar ground, carrying little more than ambition sharpened by necessity. John Jacob Astor did not enter a land of opportunity. He entered a land of chaos, violent, uncertain, and brutally competitive. And it was inside that chaos that America's first billionaire would be forged. The United States Astor encountered was not the polished republic celebrated in textbooks. It was raw, fragmented, and lawless at the edges. Wealth was not inherited yet. It was seized. There were no safeguards, no regulations, no moral guardrails. Survival favored the observant, the ruthless, and the patient. For immigrants like Astor, failure meant disappearance. Success meant reinvention. From the moment he arrived, he understood a truth that many around him did not. America rewarded those who could see systems forming before anyone else recognized them as systems at all. Astor did not begin as a visionary. He began as a listener. He watched how money moved, who controlled access, and where power quietly accumulated. He paid attention to what others dismissed as temporary or unimportant. In a society obsessed with trade and quick profit, Astor noticed the mechanisms underneath supply routes, political leverage, and most importantly, scarcity. He realized early that wealth in America would not belong to those who worked hardest, but to those who positioned themselves closest to control. His early years were marked by discipline bordering on obsession. Astor lived frugally, spoke carefully, and revealed nothing of his intentions. He blended into the growing crowds of merchants and traders, appearing unremarkable by design. This invisibility was not weakness. It was strategy. While others chased immediate gain, Astor studied patterns that repeated. He learned that chaos did not eliminate opportunity, it multiplied it for those who understood how to navigate instability without becoming its victim. America was expanding violently outward. Frontiers pushed west. Trade routes opened and collapsed. Indigenous lands were seized and exploited. This was not an era of clean hands or noble enterprise. It was an age where fortunes were built on imbalance and extraction. Astor did not create these conditions, but he mastered them. He recognized that the future belonged to those willing to operate without sentiment while maintaining the appearance of respectability. What separated Astor from his contemporaries was patience. He was not in a hurry to be admired. He was in a hurry to be unassailable. While others displayed wealth as proof of success, Astor concealed his growing influence. He understood that attention attracted competition and competition attracted risk. His ambition was not to rise loudly, but to root himself so deeply that removal would become impossible. This mindset reflected something uniquely American at the time. The old world celebrated lineage. The new world rewarded leverage. Astor adapted faster than most because he abandoned nostalgia entirely. He did not romanticize his origins or idealize the nation he entered. He treated America as a machine, one that could be learned, manipulated, and eventually dominated by those willing to think long-term. As the young republic lurched through political uncertainty, economic volatility, and global conflict, Astor remained focused on accumulation rather than participation. He avoided ideology. He avoided loyalty. He avoided unnecessary exposure. His allegiance was not to governments or causes, but to opportunity itself. This neutrality allowed him to survive shifts that ruined others. When alliances changed, Astor remained solvent. When wars disrupted markets, Astor adapted. When competitors collapsed, Astor absorbed what they left behind. This was not luck. It was positioning. Astor placed himself at the intersection of expansion, scarcity, and control. He recognized that America's future wealth would be built not by producing goods, but by controlling the channels through which goods moved. This insight would become the foundation of everything that followed. By the time his name began to surface in business circles, Astor was already far ahead of those who noticed him. His fortune was forming quietly, layer by layer, long before it became visible. And that invisibility was the most dangerous part. Because by the time America realized what John Jacob Astor had become, he was no longer just a wealthy man. He was a system. This is where the Astor story truly begins, not with opulence or prestige, but with restraint, calculation, and an immigrant who understood that in a young nation built on instability, the greatest power belonged to those who could see the future. Before it announced itself, the fortune that would one day crown John Jacob Astor as America's first billionaire did not begin in marble halls or elegant drawing rooms. It began in blood-soaked forests, frozen rivers, and territories where law barely existed. The fur trade was not a gentleman's business. It was a brutal, exploitative system built on violence, displacement, and monopoly. And it was within this system that Astor found his first empire. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, fur was one of the most valuable commodities in the Atlantic world. European elites demanded beaver pelts for hats and garments, turning animal skins into global currency. North America became the primary extraction zone, and indigenous nations were forced into the center of this trade, often under coercion. Control of fur routes meant control of wealth. Astor understood this before most. Americans grasped the scale of what was unfolding. What distinguished Astor from other traders was not that he participated in the fur trade, but how he structured his involvement. While competitors focused on individual deals, Astor focused on systems. He did not want to trade fur. He wanted to control the flow of fur from wilderness to world markets. That meant supply chains, transportation networks, political leverage, and strategic alliances. It meant thinking like an empire before America had fully become one. Astor moved aggressively but quietly. He built relationships with indigenous intermediaries while simultaneously lobbying government officials. He understood that survival in this industry required flexibility without conscience. When treaties shifted, he adjusted. When borders moved, he adapted. When competitors failed, he absorbed their routes. The fur trade rewarded those who could operate across moral and geographic boundaries without hesitation. Violence was not an exception in this system. It was a feature. Indigenous communities were destabilized, overhunted territories were abandoned, and entire ecosystems were stripped to meet demand. Astor did not wield the knife himself, but his fortune depended on the blade. He benefited from imbalance while maintaining distance from its consequences. This separation allowed him to preserve respectability while accumulating power. The American fur company became Astor's masterpiece. It was not merely a business. It was a monopoly in formation. Through aggressive pricing, strategic partnerships, and political influence, Astor pushed rivals out. He leveraged capital to survive lean periods, knowing smaller operators could not. He played the long game, enduring short-term losses to secure long-term dominance. By the time others realized what was happening, the market was already his. Astor's timing was critical. The young United States lacked the regulatory framework to restrain monopolies. Expansion was encouraged, not questioned. Profit justified behavior. Astor exploited this environment expertly. He aligned his interests with national expansion, presenting his enterprise as a patriotic contribution rather than a private conquest. This framing protected him from scrutiny while amplifying his reach. War became an opportunity rather than a threat. During periods of conflict and embargo, supply chains fractured. Prices fluctuated wildly. Many traders collapsed under uncertainty. Astor, with diversified routes and international connections, thrived. He treated instability as leverage. Where others saw risk, he saw leverage points. The fur trade rewarded those who could operate in shadows during chaos, and Astor was comfortable there. What made his rise unsettling was how ordinary it appeared at the surface. There were no public scandals, no flamboyant displays. Astor dressed modestly, spoke carefully, and avoided social attention. This restraint was intentional. Visibility invited interference. Astor preferred to move capital, not conversation. His power grew invisibly, embedded in contracts, routes, and dependencies. The human cost of this system was enormous, but largely unrecorded. Indigenous labor was exploited, manipulated through debt and dependency. Overhunting devastated traditional economies. Communities fractured as fur demand reshaped survival itself. Astor's empire thrived on this disruption. He did not cause the collapse, but he profited from it at scale. This was the moment when American capitalism revealed its true character. Wealth was not built through innovation alone, but through consolidation. Those who controlled access, logistics, and policy amassed power far beyond those who labored. Astor became a symbol of this transition, even if the public did not yet recognize it. As his fur empire expanded, Astor learned a crucial lesson that would define his next move. Commodities fade, but control endures. Fur demand would eventually decline. Land, however, would not. The fur trade was never the destination. It was the training ground. It taught Astor how to build monopolies, manage risk, and detach profit from visibility. By the time environmental depletion and shifting fashions signaled the fur trade's limits, Astor was already planning his exit. He did not cling to declining industries out of loyalty or pride. He extracted himself methodically, converting volatile profits into stable assets. This ability to abandon a successful enterprise before it collapsed separated him from nearly everyone else in his class. The fur trade made Astor rich, but more importantly, it made him strategic. It taught him that wealth in America was not about production, it was about positioning. It was about standing at the narrow points where movement, trade, and expansion had no choice but to pass through you. This understanding marked the true birth of America's first billionaire. Not when he accumulated money, but when he mastered systems. The fur trade was brutal, extractive, and deeply destructive. But it revealed something darker and more enduring, that capitalism, when left unchecked, rewards those who can distance themselves from consequences while tightening their grip on control. Astor emerged from this world transformed. He was no longer merely a trader. He was an architect of power. And with the lessons of fur, blood, and monopoly firmly learned, he turned his gaze towards something even more permanent than trade. Land itself. What followed would reshape not only his fortune, but the future of American wealth forever. As the young American Republic lurched from crisis to crisis, war became the great separator between those who lost everything and those who understood how to profit from instability. For John Jacob Astor, conflict was never a threat to be avoided. It was a condition to be managed, exploited, and ultimately mastered. In an era when loyalty shifted with borders and laws bent under pressure, Astor learned that neutrality was not weakness. It was leverage. The late 18th and early 19th centuries were defined by uncertainty. European empires clashed across oceans. Trade embargoes choked supply lines. Naval blockades turned ports into liabilities overnight. Merchants who tied their fortunes to single governments or routes found themselves ruined when political winds changed. Astor did not make this mistake. He positioned himself above allegiance, aligning not with nations, but with opportunity. When the United States imposed trade restrictions and embargoes during conflicts with Britain and France, most American merchants suffered catastrophic losses. Ships were seized. Cargo rotted in ports. Markets collapsed. Astor adapted. He rerouted supply chains, exploited loopholes, and leveraged foreign connections built long before crisis struck. Where others saw paralysis, he saw openings created by confusion. Astor understood something fundamental about war. Economies. Scarcity multiplies profit for those who can still move goods. His network spanned borders that governments could not fully control. He worked through intermediaries, proxies, and layered ownership structures that obscured his direct involvement. This insulation allowed him to continue operating when direct trade became dangerous or illegal. The War of 1812 marked a defining moment. As British blockades strangled American commerce, Astor maneuvered with precision. He secured special permissions, leveraged diplomatic channels, and quietly negotiated outcomes that preserved his interests. While patriotic rhetoric filled newspapers, Astor focused on logistics. Ideology was noise. Infrastructure was power. This period revealed Astor's most controversial strength, his ability to profit regardless of who claimed victory. War did not require him to choose sides, only to understand consequences. If British forces dominated trade routes, Astor adapted. If American policy shifted, he complied strategically while preserving flexibility. His wealth grew not because he predicted outcomes, but because he prepared for all of them. Many contemporaries viewed this adaptability as moral ambiguity. Astor viewed it as survival. He did not believe systems rewarded loyalty. They rewarded preparedness. His approach reflected a deeper truth about early American capitalism. It thrived not on national identity, but on global leverage. Astor's dealings extended into Europe, where he monitored political developments closely. He understood that American markets were inseparable from global events. Currency fluctuations, wartime shortages, and diplomatic tensions all created volatility. Astor did not fear volatility. He priced it in. The embargoes that ruined others strengthened him. Smaller traders lacked the capital to survive prolonged disruption. They sold assets at losses, exited markets, or defaulted. Astor, flush with reserves, absorbed their positions. Crisis accelerated consolidation. Each war thinned the field, leaving Astor more dominant when peace returned. This pattern repeated itself. Conflict arrived. Markets panicked. Astor waited. Then he moved. His patience was not passive. It was strategic stillness. He allowed systems to break around him, then rebuilt them with himself at the center. What made this strategy effective was his reputation for discretion. Governments tolerated him because he was useful. Competitors feared him because he was resilient. Partners trusted him because he honored contracts even during chaos. This reliability, rare in unstable times, made him indispensable. Yet behind this image lay ruthless calculation. Astor did not rescue failing partners out of loyalty. He acquired them. He did not stabilize markets for public good. He stabilized his position within them. War was not a moral event in his calculus. It was a reordering mechanism. The lesson Astor internalized during these years was clear. Power belongs to those who survive transition. Empires fall. Policies reverse. But infrastructure, capital, and adaptability persist. Astor built his fortune not on permanence, but on motion. This ability to profit from upheaval reshaped his identity. He was no longer simply reacting to history. He was anticipating it. War taught him that the greatest risk was visibility. The louder a merchant declared loyalty, the more exposed he became. Astor preferred silence. By the time peace returned, Astor emerged wealthier, more connected, and more influential than before. Each conflict reinforced his dominance. Each crisis validated his strategy. The system rewarded his neutrality because it needed continuity more than morality. This era also deepened Astor's distrust of volatile industries. He saw how quickly fortunes evaporated when tied to trade alone. Goods could be seized. Routes could close. Laws could change. He began seeking assets immune to war. Land did not move. It could not be embargoed. It did not sink. It waited. This realization would soon redefine Astor's empire. War had taught him how to win without choosing sides. It had revealed the limits of commerce and the durability of control. And it had prepared him for the most decisive transformation of his career, one that would convert wartime profit into generational dominance. Astor had mastered chaos. Now he intended to outlast it. The moment John Jacob Astor truly separated himself from every other titan of his age came not during war or trade, but in silence when he began buying land that no one else wanted. While merchants chased ships, cargo, and contracts, Astor turned his attention to something immovable, unglamorous, and profoundly underestimated. Dirt. In a city most still viewed as temporary, he saw permanence. In a frontier still defined by uncertainty, he saw inevitability. Manhattan to Astor was not a place. It was destiny waiting to be claimed. At the turn of the 19th century, New York was not yet the financial capital of the world. It was a crowded port city with uneven growth, unpredictable markets, and vast stretches of undeveloped land. To most businessmen, real estate was secondary to trade. Land tied up capital, required patience, and produced slow returns. Astor understood that this was precisely why it mattered. Everyone else was racing. He was waiting. His insight was simple and devastatingly accurate. Trade made men rich. Land made families powerful. Goods moved. Markets shifted. Governments changed. But land endured. And more importantly, land increased in value not because of what the owner did, but because of what everyone else would eventually be forced to do around it. Astor did not need to improve Manhattan. He only needed to own it. He began acquiring property systematically, often quietly, purchasing plots far north of what was then considered valuable. These areas were dismissed as remote, impractical, even absurd. Streets did not yet exist. Infrastructure was non-existent. Critics mocked the idea that the city would ever expand that far. Astor welcomed their laughter. It kept prices low, though this was not speculation in the modern sense. It was inevitability investing. Astor studied population growth, migration patterns, and commercial expansion. He understood that cities grow outward before they grow upward. As trade expanded and people arrived, Manhattan would stretch north whether planners wanted it to or not. Owning that future meant owning power. Astor's approach to real estate was methodical and unemotional. He did not flip properties. He leased them. Leasing preserved ownership while generating steady income. It allowed him to maintain control indefinitely. Tenants came and went. The land remained Astor's. This single decision ensured that his fortune would compound rather than reset. He structured leases with precision, locking in terms that favored the owner across decades. Rent increased predictably. Responsibility shifted downward. Risk flowed away from him. These contracts became instruments of control rather than mere agreements. They bound the city's growth directly to his balance sheet. As New York expanded, Astor's holdings became unavoidable. Streets were laid through his land. Businesses rented from him. Homes were built on his property. The city grew atop his portfolio. Astor did not need political office to influence development. Ownership gave him veto power without visibility. This strategy also insulated him from volatility. Economic downturns slowed trade, but people still needed land. Even in recessions, his leases produced income. When markets crashed, Astor waited. Time worked for him, not against him. What made his real estate empire so formidable was its invisibility. Unlike factories or ships, land did not advertise ownership loudly. There were no public ceremonies, no dramatic expansions. Astor's name appeared quietly on deeds and contracts. Power accumulated without spectacle. As wealth flowed in, Astor resisted temptation. He did not build palaces. He did not indulge publicly. He reinvested relentlessly. Each acquisition reinforced the next. This restraint confused observers. They mistook humility for limitation. In reality, it was discipline. Astor's real estate strategy also reshaped how wealth functioned in America. It introduced a model of passive dominance. Control without participation. Influence without exposure. The land generated income regardless of Astor's involvement. This separation allowed him to scale power without scaling risk. As the city matured, so did the implications of his ownership. Tenants depended on him. Developers negotiated with him. City planners worked around him. Astor became an anchor point in New York's economic ecosystem. He did not command publicly, but his presence shaped decisions. This model created generational leverage. Land could be inherited, divided, and managed without losing coherence. Unlike trade empires that fractured after a founder's death, Astor's real estate portfolio was designed for continuity. It could survive mediocrity. It could survive indifference. It only required time. By mid-career, Astor's wealth surpassed what most could comprehend. Yet he remained personally austere. This contrast fueled myth. Some viewed him as miserly. Others saw genius. Both missed the point. Astor understood that visibility was a liability. His fortune was safest when unnoticed. The Manhattan Revelation transformed Astor from a successful capitalist into a systemic force. He was no longer competing within markets. He was shaping the terrain on which markets operated. This was power in its most durable form. Real estate also allowed Astor to step away from morally volatile industries. As fur declined and trade grew unstable, land offered legitimacy. It anchored his wealth to the city's future rather than its past. It aligned his interests with growth rather than extraction. In this shift, Astor became something new. Not a merchant, not a trader, a landlord on a scale America had never seen. And landlords, unlike traders, do not need to chase opportunity. Opportunity comes to them. This realization marked the point of no return. Astor's fortune was no longer vulnerable to fashion, war, or market sentiment. It was embedded in geography itself. Manhattan would rise whether he lived or died. And as it rose, so would the value of his holdings. By the time others recognized what he had done, it was too late. The land was gone. The prices were too high. The future had already been purchased. Astor did not predict New York's rise. He engineered his position within it. And in doing so, he rewrote the rules of American wealth, proving that the greatest fortunes are built not by moving faster than others, but by standing exactly where the future is forced to pass. By the time John Jacob Astor's wealth reached a scale that no American had ever seen before, one fact unsettled his contemporaries more than the size of his fortune itself. He did not live like a rich man. There were no extravagant palaces, no endless banquets, no public indulgence to match his dominance. In an era when success was increasingly displayed through spectacle, Astor chose restraint. This was not modesty. It was control. And it became one of the most misunderstood, yet most powerful tools in his rise to becoming America's first billionaire. Astor believed that spending was weakness. Every dollar released into display was a dollar no longer working. While other elites used wealth to signal arrival, Astor used discipline to secure permanence. He dressed plainly, lived conservatively, and avoided social excess. To some, this made him appear miserly, even small. In reality, it made him untouchable. He understood that true power did not need to be seen to be effective. This philosophy was rooted in fear as much as foresight. Astor had witnessed too many fortunes evaporate through indulgence, speculation, and ego. He had seen men confuse wealth with immortality, only to lose everything when markets shifted. Astor internalized a different lesson. Survival mattered more than admiration. Longevity mattered more than pleasure. His frugality was systematic. Expenses were scrutinized. Investments were calculated. Nothing was emotional. Even generosity was strategic. Charity, when given, reinforced influence or stability. Astor never spent impulsively. Money was not a reward. It was a tool. This mindset shaped how he structured his empire. Unlike industrialists who reinvested aggressively into expansion that required constant oversight, Astor favored assets that demanded patience rather than management. Land did not need innovation. It needed ownership. Leasing generated income without operational risk. This allowed his fortune to grow even while he remained personally disengaged. Astor also understood taxation before taxation truly existed in modern form. By minimizing visible wealth and extravagant consumption, he avoided scrutiny. Governments taxed what they could see. Public outrage followed excess. Astor offered neither. His wealth hid in contracts, deeds, and future value. It was real but not provocative. This invisibility was intentional. In a society still forming its relationship with extreme wealth, Astor avoided becoming a symbol. Symbols attract resistance. By remaining personally austere, he allowed his empire to expand quietly. No crowds protested landlords they could not see. No politicians campaigned against a man who looked unremarkable. The psychological discipline required for this restraint was immense. Astor denied himself comforts he could easily afford. He resisted social prestige that came with elite circles. He accepted unpopularity. But in exchange he gained something far rarer, insulation. His fortune was built to survive resentment. Astor's personal habits mirrored his business strategy. He avoided debt. He distrusted leverage. He believed borrowed money corrupted judgment. While others expanded rapidly through credit, Astor expanded slowly through certainty. This meant his empire grew steadily, without the fragility that destroyed leveraged rivals. As his wealth compounded, Astor's influence increased without his presence. People depended on him whether they knew him or not. Rent flowed. Leases renewed. The city grew around his holdings. He did not need to attend meetings or assert authority publicly. Ownership spoke for him. This created a paradox. Astor became unimaginably powerful while remaining socially isolated. He was respected, but not beloved. Feared but rarely admired. This suited him. Popularity was fleeting. Control was durable. His children inherited not just wealth, but this philosophy. Astor did not prepare them for extravagance. He prepared them for stewardship. The fortune was not to be consumed, but preserved. He warned against lifestyle inflation, social entanglements, and emotional decisions. The dynasty would endure only if discipline survived the founder. This approach separated Astor from later Gilded Age magnates. Industrialists like Vanderbilt would build monuments to dominance. Astor built foundations beneath the city. His power did not dazzle. It embedded itself. Critics accused him of hoarding wealth while contributing little to society. Astor would not have disagreed. He did not believe wealth existed to uplift others. He believed it existed to secure family dominance. Morality was secondary to continuity. Yet this same restraint allowed his fortune to survive his death intact. There was no overextension. No catastrophic speculation. No public backlash demanding redistribution. The empire passed smoothly to heirs, intact and expanding. Astor's frugality also reshaped American perceptions of wealth. It introduced the idea that the richest man in the nation might live quietly, invisibly, almost anonymously. This shattered the association between wealth and spectacle. Power could be silent. In this silence, Astor achieved something unprecedented. He became untethered from time. His fortune did not peak and decline. It stabilized and multiplied. The money itself became less important than the system it sustained. This was how Astor became America's first billionaire without ever behaving like one. Not through indulgence but denial. Not through display, but discipline. Not through excess, but control. And in doing so, he proved a truth that still governs elite wealth today. The most enduring fortunes are not built by those who spend lavishly, but by those who understand that the greatest luxury is not consumption, it is permanence. When John Jacob Astor died, his fortune did not collapse, scatter, or fade into legend. It transferred cleanly, deliberately, and intact. That outcome alone placed him among the rarest figures in economic history. Most empires fracture the moment their founder disappears. Astor's did the opposite. It settled. It institutionalized. It became a dynasty. And in that transition from man to system, the Astor name achieved a form of power far more durable than individual genius. Astor had not built wealth for personal glory. He had built it to survive him. Every lease, every parcel of land, every contractual detail reflected this intention. The empire was designed to function even in the hands of less exceptional successors. It required patience, not brilliance. Discipline, not vision. This was the quiet genius of Astor's final act. His heirs inherited something unprecedented. In America, wealth that did not require active creation. They did not need to invent industries or conquer markets. They only needed to manage, preserve, and defend what already existed. The city of New York would do the rest. As it expanded, so did their fortune. The Astors became landlords to growth itself. This shift altered the family's role in society. John Jacob Astor had been a capitalist. His descendants became aristocrats. Their power no longer came from participating in commerce. but from controlling the conditions under which commerce operated. They were not innovators. They were gatekeepers. As generations passed, the Astors refined this position. They invested in social capital as carefully as financial capital. Elite marriages reinforced alliances. Social appearances were strategic. Philanthropy was calibrated to enhance legitimacy without undermining authority. The family learned how to exist above competition. The Astor name became synonymous with New York high society. Not because they were the flashiest, but because they were the most entrenched. Their wealth felt permanent. It predated most institutions and outlasted most rivals. This permanence granted them cultural authority. They did not need to prove relevance. They embodied it. This transition marked a crucial evolution in American wealth. For the first time, a family occupied a role previously reserved for European nobility. The Astors did not hold titles, but they held terrain. Their influence was economic rather than legal, but it was just as binding. The family's real power lay in invisibility. Unlike industrial magnates whose factories drew attention, the Astors owned land quietly. Their income flowed through leases, not production. This insulated them from labor unrest, technological disruption, and public resentment. They could afford to be patient, yet this insulation came at a cost. As the family grew removed from the mechanisms that created wealth, its members grew detached from innovation. The dynasty thrived on preservation rather than adaptation. This made it powerful, but also rigid. The Astors became symbols of old money in a nation increasingly dominated by new wealth. Industrialists and financiers rose quickly, flaunting fortunes built in steel, oil, and railroads. The Astors watched from a distance. They did not compete. They waited. Their power did not depend on trends. This waiting reinforced their identity. They were no longer builders of America's economy. They were custodians of its geography. Their wealth was tied to the city's very existence. As long as New York mattered, so would the Astors. This arrangement shaped family behavior. Risk was discouraged. Innovation was unnecessary. Education emphasized refinement rather than enterprise. Children were taught to protect legacy, not expand it. This ensured continuity, but it also sowed the seeds of stagnation. Still, for decades, the system worked flawlessly. The family's wealth compounded quietly. Their social position solidified. They became arbiters of taste, gatekeepers of elite society, and silent beneficiaries of urban growth. The Astors' dominance also influenced how Americans perceived class. Their presence suggested that social hierarchy could exist even in a republic. Titles were absent, but privilege remained. The Astors proved that democracy did not eliminate aristocracy. It merely rebranded it as landlords rather than employers. The Astors avoided direct conflict with labor movements. They were shielded from strikes and protests. This distance preserved their image while others absorbed public anger. It was a structural advantage embedded in their inheritance. Over time, the family's name became more powerful than its members. Individual Astors mattered less than the dynasty itself. The system had succeeded. The man had disappeared, leaving behind a mechanism that functioned independently. This was the culmination of John Jacob Astor's vision. He had not simply accumulated wealth. He had engineered permanence. His descendants lived inside a structure designed to protect them from the volatility that defined American capitalism. Yet this permanence carried an unspoken tension. A system built to endure can also resist change. And as America transformed rapidly, the Astor Dynasty would eventually face a world that no longer rewarded stillness as reliably as it once had. For now, though the Astors stood at the peak of American society, not because they moved fastest, but because they had already arrived. By the time the Astor Dynasty reached its cultural peak, money alone was no longer the source of its authority. Wealth had become merely the foundation. What elevated the Astors above other rich families was their control over social legitimacy itself. They did not just possess fortune. They defined who belonged at the top of American society and who did not. This was power expressed not through industry or politics, but through rules unwritten, unchallenged. and ruthlessly enforced. 19th century America claimed to reject aristocracy. Yet the Astors proved how easily hierarchy could be rebuilt without titles. High society became their domain. Invitations mattered more than laws. Appearances mattered more than merit. Access became the currency of influence, and the Astors controlled the gate. To be accepted by them was to be validated. To be excluded was to remain wealthy but socially irrelevant. At the center of this system stood social ritual. Balls, dinners, clubs, and private gatherings were not entertainment. They were instruments of control. Every guest list was curated. Every introduction was calculated. Social space was structured like architecture, entry points limited, movement controlled, exits enforced through silence rather than force. The Astors understood that exclusion did not need confrontation. It only required omission. Carolyn Astor, known simply as Mrs. Astor, became the most powerful unelected figure in New York society. Her influence surpassed politicians and industrialists alike. She did not create wealth. She regulated prestige. The infamous list of the 400 symbolized this authority, suggesting that only a select few truly mattered in a city of millions. This number was not about capacity. It was about control. Through her, the Astor Dynasty transformed wealth into social law. New money could buy mansions, but it could not buy acceptance. Industrialists who reshaped the economy found themselves socially inferior to families who controlled nothing but legacy. This inversion reinforced the Astors' dominance. They no longer needed to compete economically. They judged. This system served a strategic purpose. By positioning themselves as cultural arbiters, the Astors insulated their wealth from challenge. Criticizing them meant risking social exile. Aligning with them meant stability. Even rivals hesitated to confront a family whose approval governed reputations. High society also functioned as a filtering mechanism. Marriages were arranged with care. Alliances reinforced wealth concentration. Outsiders were evaluated not by ability, but by ancestry, behavior, and compliance. The dynasty perpetuated itself socially as efficiently as it did financially. This social architecture mirrored the physical architecture the Astors controlled. Just as their real estate organized space vertically and invisibly, their social system organized people horizontally and quietly. Everyone knew their place. Movement upward required permission. Movement downward required only a misstep. Yet this dominance came with fragility. Social power depends on relevance. As America industrialized, new fortunes emerged that did not seek validation. Steel, oil, and railroads created wealth too large to ignore. These men did not need society. Society needed them. The Astors faced a dilemma they had never encountered before. Competition that could not be excluded. Still, they resisted. They tightened their rules. They clung to tradition. They dismissed newcomers as vulgar, believing refinement would always outrank capital. For a time, they were correct. Old money still commanded respect. The Astor name still carried weight. But beneath the surface, the system was aging. Social authority that relies on exclusion must continually justify itself. Younger generations questioned its relevance. New elites formed parallel circles. The monopoly on prestige began to fracture. The Astors responded as they always had, by remaining still. They believed permanence would prevail. They underestimated how quickly American culture was changing. Democracy, media, and mass wealth disrupted the quiet agreements that once governed elite life. Yet even as their social dominance waned, its impact endured. The model they created became the template for elite behavior. Private clubs, exclusive neighborhoods, curated networks, controlled access. The Astors did not invent these mechanisms, but they perfected them. High society was never about pleasure. It was about insulation. It protected wealth from scrutiny and power from challenge. It transformed inequality into etiquette. It made hierarchy appear tasteful rather than oppressive. This was the Astors' most subtle achievement. They proved that control does not require force when culture does the work for you. That silence can be stronger than command. That belonging, once weaponized, becomes an instrument of domination. In the end, their social empire outlived their economic supremacy. Even as fortunes shifted and names faded, the structures they built remained. America learned from the Astors how to separate wealth from accountability, power from visibility, and privilege from explanation. This was the quiet architecture of old money, and for a time, the Astors were its undisputed architects. By the dawn of the 20th century, the world that had elevated the Astor Dynasty was changing faster than the family was willing to change with it. The systems that once rewarded patience, restraint, and inherited position were being disrupted by speed, scale, and visibility. America was no longer a nation quietly consolidating wealth. It was an industrial force exploding outward. And for the first time, the Astors were not ahead of the transformation, they were reacting to it. New wealth arrived aggressively. Industrialists built fortunes in steel, oil, railroads, and finance at a pace that dwarfed earlier accumulation. These men did not wait for cities to grow around them. They reshaped cities themselves. They built factories, employed armies of workers, and controlled entire industries. Their wealth demanded attention, and unlike the Astors, they were unafraid of it. Visibility became power, not risk. This shift exposed the limits of the Astor model. Their wealth was immense but static. It grew steadily but not explosively. Land appreciated, but it did not dominate headlines. The family's influence depended on social authority and historical presence, not innovation. In a culture increasingly obsessed with progress, this began to look like stagnation. The Astors' response was caution. They avoided speculative ventures. They resisted industrial expansion. They trusted that permanence would outlast disruption. For decades, this instinct had served them well. But now it isolated them. While others shaped the future, the Astors guarded the past. Internal divisions deepened this vulnerability. Later generations lacked the founders' discipline and strategic clarity. The fortune no longer demanded engagement, only maintenance. Some heirs grew complacent. Others indulged quietly. The system designed to survive mediocrity now confronted it directly. Meanwhile, external pressures mounted. Progressive reforms challenged monopolies and land concentration. Taxation increased. Public scrutiny of wealth intensified. Journalists exposed inequality. Politicians spoke openly about redistribution. The Astors, once invisible, found themselves symbols of a vanishing order. Their social authority weakened as well. High society fractured into competing circles. New elites formed their own institutions, indifferent to old money approval. Prestige diversified. The Astors could no longer define legitimacy alone. Exclusion lost its bite. Real estate, once a shield, became a target. Urban density intensified conflict over land use, rents, and housing conditions. Landlords faced criticism as cities struggled with overcrowding and inequality. The Astors, distant from daily operations, felt these pressures indirectly but persistently. The family's reluctance to modernize compounded the issue. They invested conservatively, avoiding risk but also missing opportunity. As financial markets evolved, their model appeared outdated. Liquidity mattered. Flexibility mattered. The Astors prized stability above all else. This conservatism preserved wealth but eroded relevance. The family remained rich but less influential. They owned space, but not momentum. America was no longer content to let history dictate hierarchy. Cultural shifts accelerated the decline. Mass media democratized attention. Newspapers and later radio reshaped public perception. Wealth could no longer hide easily. Stories mattered. Narratives formed. The Astors, unused to scrutiny, struggled to control their image. Even philanthropy, once a tool of legitimacy, evolved. New magnates used charity strategically, shaping institutions, universities, and public policy. The Astors' restrained giving appeared passive by comparison. Influence moved where engagement followed. World events intensified this pressure. Global conflict, economic upheaval, and social change redefined power. Old money systems built for continuity faltered under volatility. Adaptation became essential. The Astors' greatest strength, patience, became a liability. They waited for stability that never returned. The world no longer rewarded stillness. It rewarded transformation, yet the decline was not sudden. It unfolded quietly, fitting the family's nature. No dramatic collapse. No public disgrace. Just gradual displacement. Their dominance faded as new structures replaced old ones. What remained was legacy without control. The Astors still owned land, still held wealth, but no longer shaped direction. They became custodians of history rather than architects of the future. His transition marked the end of an era. Not just for one family, but for a form of power rooted in silence and inheritance. America had moved into a new phase, louder, faster, and less deferential. The cracks in the Astor Empire revealed a broader truth. Systems that refuse to evolve do not collapse immediately. They recede. They become background. And eventually, they become memory. Though the Astors had mastered permanence in a world that now demanded motion. And in that mismatch, their supremacy quietly slipped away. In April of 1912, the Astor Dynasty faced a moment that would come to symbolize not just personal tragedy, but the quiet end of an age. John Jacob Astor, the fourth great-grandson of the founder and the richest passenger aboard the RMS Titanic, stepped onto a ship that represented the pinnacle of Edwardian confidence. The Titanic was marketed as unsinkable, a floating monument to human progress, engineering mastery, and industrial certainty. Its passengers included industrialists, aristocrats, financiers, and heirs whose fortunes seemed as permanent as steel. Among them, Astor embodied old American wealth at its peak, immense, inherited and assumed to be enduring. Astor was not merely rich. He was a product of the dynasty's full maturation. Educated, cultured, inventive, and socially dominant, he represented the version of old money that had learned to coexist with modernity without surrendering its authority. He had served in the Spanish-American War, written novels, patented mechanical inventions, and rebuilt hotels. Yet none of these achievements defined him as much as his name. Astor was a title as much as a person, a symbol of America's first billion-dollar lineage, moving confidently into the 20th century. The voyage itself was controversial before it began. Astor's marriage to Madeline Force, a woman nearly 3 decades younger, had scandalized New York society. The union exposed a growing fracture between old social codes and modern behavior. The Astors had long enforced strict moral and social expectations within elite circles. Now one of their own challenged those norms openly. The criticism was relentless. Newspapers mocked. Society whispered. The dynasty's moral authority, once unquestioned, showed visible strain. The Titanic was meant to be an escape. Astor and his pregnant wife boarded in Cherbourg, bound for New York after an extended European stay. First-class accommodations offered unmatched luxury, private promenades, Turkish baths, opulent dining rooms, and personal servants. The ship was not just transportation. It was a controlled environment where wealth insulated its owners from the outside world. Much like the Astor estates themselves, when the ship struck the iceberg on April 14th, the illusion shattered with brutal speed. What followed exposed the fragile assumptions beneath elite confidence. Protocol dictated that women and children be evacuated first. Astor complied without protest. Witnesses recalled him calmly assisting Madeline into a lifeboat, ensuring she was safe before stepping back. He did not attempt to leverage his name, wealth, or status. In that moment, the dynasty's code of restraint and duty manifested fully. John Jacob Astor IV did not survive the night. His body was later recovered from the Atlantic, identified by a gold watch, diamond rings, and engraved cufflink symbols of a life of privilege rendered meaningless in cold water. His death stunned the nation. Newspapers emphasized the irony. The richest man aboard the world's most advanced ship, undone by nature and human arrogance. It was not just a personal loss. It was cultural symbolism. The Titanic disaster resonated deeply because it contradicted the prevailing narrative of unstoppable progress. The Astors had thrived under that narrative. They had built wealth by betting on permanence, systems, and inevitability. The sinking suggested that even the most carefully constructed empires could fail suddenly and completely. The public absorbed this lesson instinctively. In the years that followed, the Astor name lost some of its mystique. The family remained wealthy, but the sense of invincibility was gone. John Jacob Astor IV had been one of the last figures who bridged the Gilded Age and the modern world with authority intact. His death marked the passing of a generation that believed control could outlast change. The timing mattered. America was already shifting. Progressive reform, rising labor movements, and increasing scrutiny of inherited wealth were reshaping public attitudes. The Titanic tragedy accelerated a broader reckoning. Wealth was no longer admired unconditionally. It was questioned, examined, sometimes resented. The Astors, once admired for discretion, now seemed distant and outdated. Inheritance itself came under scrutiny. Astor's estate was vast, but divided. Legal battles followed. Taxes took their share. The fortune, while still enormous, became fragmented. This was not a collapse, but an erosion. The centralized control that had defined the dynasty weakened with each generation. The social world the Astors had dominated also fractured. The rigid hierarchies of old New York society softened. New money asserted itself unapologetically. Industrialists and financiers no longer sought approval from legacy families. They created their own institutions, clubs, and standards. Influence diversified. The Astors' gatekeeping role diminished. Culturally, the Titanic became shorthand for the failure of elite certainty. Literature, film, and journalism returned to the disaster repeatedly, reinforcing its symbolism. The Astors, once associated with stability, were now linked to tragedy. Their narrative shifted from dominance to vulnerability. The family's response was characteristically quiet. There were no public campaigns to reclaim influence. No attempts to reinvent the dynasty. They continued managing properties, trusts, and estates with discretion. This restraint preserved wealth but forfeited cultural leadership. America moved on. By the 1920s, the Astors were no longer central figures in national life. They remained present in real estate and philanthropy, but absent from imagination. Other names defined ambition now. Rockefeller, Carnegie, Morgan. The Astors felt historical rather than contemporary. The Titanic marked more than a death. It marked the end of the belief that lineage alone guaranteed relevance. The world was becoming faster, louder, and less patient. It rewarded visibility, innovation, and scale. The Astors had mastered patience and silence. Those virtues no longer commanded the same respect. In retrospect, the tragedy feels inevitable. Not because Astor deserved his fate, but because the system he represented was incompatible with the century unfolding. Old money had reached its natural limit. It could endure, but it could not dominate. The sea that claimed John Jacob Astor IV also claimed an idea, the idea that wealth inherited once could remain supreme forever. After the Titanic, the Astor Dynasty continued, but it no longer defined America. It became part of the background, woven into the city's foundations but absent from its future. The iceberg did not destroy the Astors. Time did. The Titanic simply made the transition visible. By the mid-20th century, the Astor Dynasty still existed on paper. In trust documents, property deeds, and quiet family registries, but its era of dominance had long passed. The name remained etched into the geography of New York. Astor Place, Astoria, the remnants of the Waldorf Astoria legacy, but these were monuments, not centers of power. The Astors had become custodians of history rather than architects of the future. This final chapter of their story is not about sudden collapse but about gradual disappearance. The slow fading of a family that once defined what American wealth looked like. What made the decline so complete was not bankruptcy or scandal, but relevance. The 20th century did not reward invisibility. New fortunes were loud, aggressive, and constantly expanding. Industrial capitalism evolved into corporate capitalism, and then into financial capitalism. Power shifted from land ownership to stocks, from fixed assets to scalable systems. The Astors had built their fortune on permanence, land that could not be moved, rents that arrived steadily, structures that symbolized stability. That model was safe, but it was no longer dominant. As skyscrapers replaced brownstones and corporations replaced families, the Astors' real estate empire began to feel conservative, even cautious. They still owned valuable properties, but they rarely led development. They leased rather than transformed. They preserved rather than reinvented. In an age obsessed with growth, this restraint appeared as stagnation. Their wealth endured, but it did not multiply at the speed of newer dynasties. Culturally, the Astors withdrew almost entirely. Unlike other old money families that adapted by entering politics, philanthropy, or public leadership, the Astors chose privacy. This decision was consistent with their values, but costly in influence. America does not remember those who remain silent. It remembers those who shape narratives. By refusing visibility, the Astors allowed their story to be told by others and eventually forgotten. The Waldorf Astoria itself became the ultimate symbol of this transition. Once a private expression of Astor dominance, it evolved into a commercial institution detached from family control. The hotel outlived the dynasty's authority over it. Guests slept under chandeliers built by Astor money, unaware of the family that made them possible. The Astors became background architecture in their own creation. Inheritance continued, but dilution was inevitable. Each generation received smaller portions of the original fortune, divided among heirs with diverse interests and priorities. Some pursued art, others diplomacy. Some retreated entirely from public life. None rebuilt the centralized command that had once defined the dynasty. The Astors became individuals rather than a force. This fragmentation was not failure, it was entropy. Dynasties are unnatural structures. They require constant reinforcement, adaptation, and ambition across generations. The Astors had mastered the first generation's hunger and the second generation's management. They never mastered reinvention. Their restraint, once their greatest strength, became their limitation. By the late 20th century, the Astor name evoked nostalgia rather than power. Historians spoke of them in the past tense. Documentaries framed them as origins, not participants. Their story was taught, not followed. The family that once set the terms of elite society now existed as a case study in how wealth ages. Yet the Astors' disappearance from dominance does not diminish their achievement. In many ways, their story is uniquely American. They arrived with nothing. They exploited opportunity ruthlessly. They converted trade into land, land into power, and power into legitimacy. They built institutions that outlasted them. Few families can claim the same. Their decline also offers a rare lesson in restraint. Unlike dynasties destroyed by excess, corruption, or spectacle, the Astors faded quietly. There were no dramatic court cases, no criminal indictments, no public disgrace. Their exit was dignified, controlled, almost intentional. They did not burn out. They dimmed. This quiet ending reflects the dynasty's original philosophy. Wealth was never meant to be loud. Power was meant to be structural. Influence was strongest when invisible. For a time, this philosophy worked perfectly. But invisibility has a cost in a world that constantly reshapes itself. In modern America, the Astors survive mostly as symbols. They represent the moment when money first became permanent, when capitalism learned to reproduce itself across generations. They also represent the limits of that permanence. No dynasty, no matter how wealthy, can remain dominant without adaptation. Their legacy lives in stone, in street names, in hotel ballrooms, and in the financial architecture of New York itself. The city they helped build still stands, but it no longer belongs to any one family. Power has decentralized. Wealth has fragmented. Influence has multiplied. The Astors did not lose America. America outgrew them. In the end, the story of the Astor Dynasty is not a tragedy but a cycle. Rise through ambition. Rule through restraint. Fade through relevance. They were America's first billionaires, and in many ways, its most instructive. They showed what wealth could build and what it could not preserve. Their empire proved that money can conquer space, shape cities, and command generations. It also proved that time remains undefeated. Dynasties are temporary. Influence expires. Only foundations endure. The Astors understood this better than most. That may be why they left without protest, without spectacle, without noise. Their silence was not weakness. It was acceptance thought, and so the Astor Dynasty ends not with collapse, but with absorption into the city they built, into the history they shaped, and into the quiet truth that no family, no matter how powerful, ever truly owns the future.